For this lesson, I thought we would look at a passage from Genesis in chapter 45. And here is towards the end of the life of Joseph, and a rather surprising event takes place in the life of Joseph. And it's that surprising event that we will try to understand as we go through the text. Right at the beginning of chapter 45 of Genesis, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. We're told in verse 2 that Joseph wept loudly. Now, Joseph had done plenty of crying and weeping in the preceding chapters of Genesis, in 42:24 and in 43:30. But this is not, on this occasion, a normal cry. It is a weeping wail of epic proportions. Joseph had risen from a foreigner to a position of leadership over all the Egyptian empire. Yet for a moment, he could not control himself. He sent away everyone so nobody would see. And yet the weeping was so loud that it could be heard from those he sent away. What was the emotion behind the weeping? Was it sadness? Was it joy? Was it just catharsis? Was it just plain mysterious? Perhaps we have experienced weeping with great sadness. I'm not referring to a few tears sliding down the cheek, but rather an ugly cry like that of Joseph. Perhaps that we can help position us to interpret this text if we have experienced the same emotion as Joseph. Wailing or crying loudly is something we don't usually plan to do, but it's something that just comes out. Like Joseph, we can't control it. The loss of control for Joseph is a bit surprising in the context of how the book of Genesis has documented the life of Joseph right back to chapter 37. Joseph appears first of all as a youngish child, and at times he sounds as though he was a bit brash. But he had to live with some severe experiences in his life. But through it all, he consistently displays immense control in scenes with enormous pressure, whether he's in prison or under sexual seduction or in the presence of Pharaoh. So the beginning of Genesis 45 provides a surprising shift, as we are told Joseph could no longer control himself. He had reunited with his brothers, yet he kept his identity secret. The reason for the secrecy is uncertain. But when Joseph finally loses control, it immediately leads to a display of God's greater control. For most of the Joseph narrative, God is surprisingly absent. This is quite unique among the patriarchal accounts of Genesis from chapter 12 to chapter 50. Abraham directly encounters God on multiple occasions, and God speaks promises to him. God also appears to Isaac to give direct commands. God interacts with Jacob and even engages in a direct struggle with him that lasts throughout the night. But unlike these other patriarchs, Joseph has no such direct experience with God. Throughout Joseph's improbable journey, from his childhood in Canaan to indentured servitude, to prison, and then royal authority, God is comparatively quiet. But despite the lack of direct divine action, Genesis 45 shows that God does not need that kind of interaction to display his full sovereignty. The longer story is set in a period of prolonged famine. Because a famine typically occurs through natural means, whether a lack of rain or pestilence, it is often a tool for displaying divine control over the earth. Within the Joseph story, famine is the way to humble the powerful Egyptian nation, while promoting the lowly foreigner who first predicted the famine through divine revelation. So within this setting, Joseph is able to articulate the divine sovereignty in his life. And this sovereignty is so much more powerful than any human action. God sent Joseph, we're told in verses 5 and 7. And Joseph forgoes blame against the brothers to subsume it under the bigger will of God with a bold declaration. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. God is the one who promoted Joseph to power. So we're told in verse 9. This recognition of God's sovereignty seems to have a profound impact on Joseph. In Genesis 42:8, the brothers are unable to physically recognize Joseph. The interactions have reversed power structures. Back in Canaan, Joseph spoke like a youngest child, with a lack of restraint and youthful arrogance, while the brothers spoke with condescension. But now with Joseph unrecognizable, he speaks in authority, and the brothers speak from their position of a lower status. Joseph makes accusations, and the brothers plead for understanding, plead for mercy. The change in authority is reinforced by Joseph's ability to wield both languages as they communicate through an interpreter in order that Joseph could mask his identity. But this crying spell, well, this marks a transformation. Joseph moves from the position of authority into one of generosity. The subtle nods of resentment in previous chapters have disappeared. Joseph is eager to forgive and to restore the family, not just for his generation, but for a dysfunction that seems to have permeated the earlier generations of Jacob Esau and Isaac Ishmael. If we read the generous spirit behind Joseph's words in Genesis 45 and compare it with some of his other words as a younger man, Joseph can fully recognize God's sovereignty in those past events. And that recognition transforms Joseph. There is no explicit meeting with God during the life of Joseph. But Joseph has realized that God was active and that God was present in all these episodes of his life. While he was down in a pit, awaiting to be sold, while he was in a foreign household as a servant, while he languished in a foreign prison, while he served before the royal court of Pharaoh. In all these settings, the divine encounter was just as profound as any of the times when God met with the patriarchs in Genesis. Perhaps knowledge that God was with him all these times and all these years brought some of that weeping. So, was it sadness? Was it joy? Was it just catharsis? Was it just plain mysterious? The answer to all of these questions is yes. But more than that, I would suggest that weeping was a manifestation of a profound transformation of Joseph. Couldn't we be looking for those moments in our lives?